Hello and welcome to the East Anglia Hobbit Community Podcast. We are here again with a lore episode, which we're going to merge with a little bit of Tactica. So joining me, CJ, today we have the resident Tolkien nerd, James Wilson.
Hello.
And we've also let in Sam, because if we don't, then he scratches at the door all day.
Or your car.
Yeah. So, first thing we're going to discuss today in honour of the month of March is the heroic march action for our Tactica. Now, when have you two fine gentlemen found it to be most advantageous to be marching with your armies?
Usually storm an objective quickly, like to seize the prize for the prime opportunity, isn't it?
Yeah, in the scenarios where it's all about movement, scenarios like reconnoiter, like the breakthrough scenario, and again scenarios where you kind of need to get through to objective as quickly as possible, that's when it comes in really, really handy. The other one is kind of if you've got like your slower moving armies, like your dwarves and your goblins as well, that really, really helps them get across the table faster. If you've got it's usually only like captains and kings that have the heroic actions these days, and then I think there's a couple of named heroes that have it. But yeah, if you've got a slow moving army, being able to get across the battlefield a lot faster really makes a difference.
All of the kings have got heroic march now, haven't they?
Most of them. There's one
yeah.
Finding all three of the things James was talking about: recon, getting across the board quickly, and marching with the king. The only one who doesn't have it, surprisingly, is a Mad King. And there's some people in the community who are upset about that.
Very well. Yeah, it used to be that because Seize the Prize was a big thing. So it used to be that basically you had to have march in order to deal with that scenario. So you'd have a march from one side, you have a march from the other side, and then the next turn you do a heroic move off, and whoever wins that have basically won. And so I used to think that basically for Lake Town, which has no mobility, so you got Bard on horse, you got Gandalf on horse, and that is it. I thought that basically a militia captain was basically compulsory to get around the board, to do Seize the Prize and all of that. And then I actually played Jay at Ardacon. I said, I notice you've got Hilda and Bilbo and things and no captain. Do you not find marches necessary? And he actually said...
He's sniggered with evil.
Well, he said that when you've got Gandalf, then you can force your opponent to drop the prize. You can stop people running off with the relic and things. So actually, on the balance of things, it's not as necessary. And I actually thought, I didn't think of that. So now I do tend to think, yeah, you'll either have march or you've got some way of controlling enemy movement instead. But now the new scenarios have come out. And we did a whole review of this a couple of weeks ago, basically saying, oh, look how much, movement is involved. You got to divide and conquer. You got to move strategically around the board. You got to destroy the supplies. You got to get 24 inches across the board and destroy their supplies. Retrieval, you got to get into their half, nick the relic, and then run back to off your board edge, which is going to be a minimum of 4 turns. All these things, and you think, oh, march could suddenly be really, really important. But could it actually be instead that we're going to see more cav units? Because before now, we've just sort of had, infantry armies, and then you'd have a couple of token cav to run off the board and reconnoiter. But now there's more incentive, I think, to cover the whole battlefield or to take like a full box worth of cavalry. So do you think that would replace the need for march in your lists?
Perfect example would be Command the Battlefield, where you literally have this big chasm in the middle of the battlefield. It's worth absolutely nothing. And quite often you find that you end up arriving on one board's edge. Person who arrives second will spend their might to isolate one unit and just wipe it out for you. And meaning you have to then start spreading out, and then obviously you start taking your courage tests and everything like that. I played against the Eagles. They didn't have anything on any of the corners by the end. They won because they wiped me out and everything had fled for me.
Yeah, same thing happened to me at the Warhammer GT last weekend. It was Command the Battlefield. I was using dwarves, and pretty much my entire contingent, large contingent of dwarves, I was using Thorin, Keely, Feely, and then Dane with a load of Iron Hills. And what essentially happened with the deployment, I got completely shafted because Dane and the Iron Hills ended up in one corner. Thorin and Keely and Feely ended up in another corner, and then my opponent's entire army just surrounded the Iron Hills dwarves, and that was pretty much it.
I remember seeing the end of that, actually, when you had Thorin literally about an inch away from the guy who needs to kill to like either draw it or win it. I can't remember which.
Yeah, I think the trouble is with that army, Dane was the only one that had heroic march, and he was never in a position where he could have done anything with it. Especially, I spent his might on heroic moves rather than marching, because it was essentially I was surrounded, and it was more important that the cavalry charged in and did the knockdowns. So this is kind of where, again, this is where like strategy plays into it, because kind of what I could have done is I could have called the march with Dane and pretty much just like run away with all the cavalry and left the infantry to hold up the orcs, but kind of I was up against like Gothmog and a load of orcs, so the biggest problem there is that he's got his master of battle, so it's kind of whatever I did, he could quite easily have countered it. So, but yeah, it comes down to a tactical decision. It could be that you call a march to get away from your opponent. So that's where it could come in handy in like the Maelstrom scenarios. If you don't want to get anywhere near your heroes, I mean, yes, they can counter with a heroic move, but if you then if they don't have the ability to do that, say for example they're out of might, I know it's unlikely, but you can use the theory march to get away from opponents who could potentially hit you from the rear.
Now, taking on from Dane, there are quite a few heroes in army lists where you've got low might, and so the decision was made by the rules team that we're going to give march to specific characters to mean that you don't have to take a king or a captain squeezed in somewhere. And I'm thinking specifically if you've got Haradrim at low points, then Suladan has march, which is nice because typically you'd have him and the Betrayer in a sort of 500-point list. You could talk about Barlin and Dane, where the number of heroes and might that you've got are going to be at an absolute premium. So you give it to some of the main leaders. There are a few examples, though, where there's some march missing from hero-heavy lists where it might have been useful. The first example that springs to mind is the fiefdoms, where you've got Imrahil, Angbor, Forlong, Dunhir. None of them have march. So your mobilities, unless you go in for a Knight of Dol Amroth captain, you won't have access to march, although there are some cheap options available from Gondor if you want to do a green ally. And the other one...
They're one who really suffer for it.
Yeah.
Has nobody in Champions of Erebor got march at all?
No one at all, unless you bring in Dane or an Iron Hills captain. But, Dane is obviously going to be 160 points because you're obviously going to mount him unless you're doing theme reasons. The Iron Hills captain is going to be, 80, I think he is?
85, I think.
80 base, yeah.
Oh yeah, and then 5 for the upgrades. So yeah, those are the only two heroes in the Erebor Reclaim list that have heroic march. None of the champions of Erebor have it. I don't think none of the dwarves have got it. I'm fairly certain Bilbo hasn't got it either.
No, but in Thorin's company, due to an FAQ, they all get heroic march to try and compensate for this. Now, the army list that I thought of with the hero heavy and no march, I thought I'd come to you, Samwise, is Dunland, because you've got Thryden, Gorolf, Frida, Oathmaker, and none of them have march. They've all got strength, as far as I'm aware.
Plenty of strengths.
Which is, the most used heroic action in the game. But how do you cope with playing Dunland, which is largely an infantry horde with limited mobility?
Well, you've got the option to bring a chieftain. They've got your march. They all unfortunately, that means typically, unless you get into like 800 plus, that means you have to get rid of one of the named heroes unless you want to really sacrifice your numbers. When I was at GT, I brought all 4 of the named heroes and a chieftain, but unfortunately, none of them had a full warband besides the chieftain for theme reasons. You really need your movement for them, as I found. So the strength can be useful in certain situations, like when you've got like something big and scary surrounded and you just want to rehack it to pieces.
But when Dunland has so many +1 to wound possibilities with the two-handed weapon, with the army bonus, and if you're playing Rohan, you get that as well. Do you really need heroic strength? Aren't you wounding stuff quite easily anyway?
Power Ogs don't get wounded easily if you're playing those.
That's true. So in terms of mobility, do you rely on having, because you have Thryden, he can mount, and he can lead a bunch of Dunland horsemen, but he's the leader, and I'd have thought you don't want to particularly have him being the reckless objective chaser. But you've also got Krebine, and you're probably one of the first people in the community to build their own and then play that profile. So tell us a bit about how that plays for you.
Krebine, which works really well for snatchy objectives. Like, what's an example? I played at Borodura, I used them to go snatch the objective. The problem is, typically you have them sat behind your lines, and then if they've got the enemy lines in front of you as well, they've usually got some mounted hero and everything. By the time you've flown 12 inches over their lines behind them, you're still within charge range of the cavalry. So you have to make sure you've got the hero well and truly pinned down or dismounted before you can start making that dash for it. It's got similarly, if they got like something like fell beasts and all that sort of thing, they can still reach you. Typically, what I tend to use it for, if there's no objective I can snatch for it, like let's say it's contest champions, for example, like get the enemy leader pinned in combat, and then use the Krebane to fly behind and trap. It gives you an extra 2 attacks to win the fight, so you're not particularly bothered about the one fight that you won. Basically, you're not particularly bothered about its strength of 2. You just want the extra attacks just to try and guarantee yourself the winning fight. It also means if you're using Thryden in that combat, then you can be a bit more reckless and maybe try the two-handed approach. What did I do the other day? I think it was... What was I fighting? Yeah, it was when I was fighting my last game with GT against N, so I managed to get the Krebane to join in the combat against Quickbeam and cause wound on him.
I think the courage on Krebine is a distinct advantage over Bat Swarms, for example. The courage 3, aren't they?
I thought there were 2. Maybe I'm playing that wrong.
So the thing with the shooting, though, that must make them incredibly useful for sending off to go and guard things or to fly off the other board edge, because you only hit them on 6s, and then the defense 3. So off the top of my head, doing the math, that would be an average of 48 elf bow shots to kill one Krebine.
The only exception to that would be Legolas, because he can do his direct hit roll, and it specifies in it, I believe, nullifies all magical powers, special rules, etc. So that would still be hit. But even so, you've got 4 wounds. He still has to take 4 turns on his own to do it, isn't he? It means they're quite reliable once they've got an objective, making the break for it. Because once they've got out of the charge range, you got to be very fortunate if you manage to stop them.
Are Krebine's affected by the 6-inch Dunland banners? I don't see why they wouldn't be.
I believe so. It says it just expands the banner's range to 6 inches. Doesn't specify anything about having to be Dunland to take the advantage of it. But
I think it would have the Dunland keyword anyway, wouldn't it?
I don't think they do. No, it's got because I've tried checking that for the sake of getting +1 to wound for all Dunlandings, I believe it was. Except they don't fall under that.
Okay, fair enough. But then that means basically Krebine with the banner will get 3 attacks to win the fight, so then Thryden can afford to go two-handed and do lots of nasty damage. That's a really potent combo.
It's 2 attacks for them, like the Bat Swarm, but it's just
but with the banner reroll.
Oh yeah, of course. Once you've got 6 for them, then you're fairly comfortable. Thryden and then can go ballistic. It's got the power of the hatred rule. It's Rohan, for example. This is probably the most spiteful example from the weekend. Was I had a wild man who went two-handed with a piercing strike, so he's essentially got strength 6 against Merry plus hatred, and he managed to chop in half, which would have required a 2+, I believe. But he did it with a 6, so he went all out.
So how do you cope in scenarios where there's a big distance between your deployment and your enemy's got quite a significant bow advantage?
We'll just have to use the terrain to your advantage on that one. I've got to try to march behind it as best you can. Try to limit the shots they can get, because for the most part they get wounding on 5s, Unless you're unfortunate enough to play like against Bard or crossbows or something like that, in which case it would be 4s.
Yeah.
If it's siege weapons, it basically wounds everything on 3s anyway. So you're not like,
So in terms of compromising the list building, then would you ever consider taking a chieftain over one of the named characters exclusively to get access to March?
If I know the scenarios in advance, it's tempting, yeah. But it's got like the one who's a direct swap will be the Oathmaker because he's 55 points as well.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is like he is so useful for getting that fearless bubble for the Wildmen and get like. Example, when I was playing against Ents, I just got auto charges, like so I've got to surround the Ent immediately, and they just tore it to pieces. Like that's just too valuable, particularly when there's so many armies dead and all sorts of other horrible terror lines. Frida, when you expect so many mounted heroes, he's really good to have around as well, and Gorolf is just brilliant for chopping things to pieces. So it's kind of a tough choice because Gorolf is also your second striker. As people have reminded me many times. I suppose Frida's probably the one you can probably most likely swap out, but it's a big gamble if you do come against like a mounted enemy. The other thing that which needs clarifying about Frida is she's got like her, nullifying mounts like bonuses in charging, because it specifies like it specifies cavalry, but when I checked with Sam. Palmer at the beginning of his event, just to get like a TO ruling, he said he wouldn't give it to monstrous mounts because they're a different variety, if that makes sense.
That possibly does need an FAQ, because if you have a Fell Beast and Radagast on Gwaihir have the cavalry keyword, and so by the letter of the law, Frida takes away their bonuses. By the law of common sense, I've got a stick here. This dragon is not going to get. Stop. I've called a Fell Beast a dragon there. James is probably going to rip my head off.
No.
What?
I quite like when you see them on tables and people have removed the wings and just got this I took a mate to Ardacon who lives in Manchester. I stayed with him and he was like, why are all these levitating worms on the tables? What are they? I did, don't worry.
Like there was one I saw the other week, which was like someone had magnetised it, and because it was all just getting away, he removed the wings and the tail, and it was basically just this like sort of hairless bouncing rabbit with a ringworm stuck on its back.
Yeah, I think that probably one of the things that they do like a lot of things with the Fell Beast is there basically there's moments where you can kind of fit the actual physical base of the model into the area you're trying to get into, but the model itself won't fit.
Sorry, I brought a spare base for my Watcher in the Water at the weekend last week because the tentacles just overhang that base enormously. And if you try and get stuff into, you go, I'm going to whip you into combat. Basically, I played the Watcher backwards. It looked really weird, but it was fine.
It's the same with it's the same. It's the same with the Mimical. You use the War Mimic, and some of the way like the tusks are positioned at the front, especially if you add like the various, like with the war lead, if you add like the spikes and things to it. There are just situations where it's just going to like snag on model. It's going to snag on model. So essentially, you have to turn it around backwards so you can get the direction of movement. What most people do is they pivot it, then they turn it around completely, then move its full distance, and then when it's reached the end of its movement, they spin it around again so it's facing the right way. So it's kind of one of those where it's just like the design of the model can cause a slight hindrance, but it doesn't overly affect the way you play the game.
Just watching the Water. Like I just want to chip in like my experience of it for the weekend, last weekend, where I had Theodred and I think it was 5 of his Royal Guard all surrounded, and I thought, brilliant, this thing is going to die because it does not have a strike. So I called my strike. Let's just do a quick bit of maths. I have 4 attacks on Theodred, which gets doubled once I've won the fight. So that's 8 attacks, rerolling wounds. I also then have 10 Royal Guard attacks, which you'll be wounding it fairly easily as well. This thing is going to die. I roll my strike, I get a 1. Bollocks. Then the Watcher also rolls a 6, and which then naturally wins the roll-off, and Theodred is torn to pieces, and suddenly the game is a very difficult one.
Yeah, I enjoyed the Watcher tremendously, but we'll cover that at a later point. I mean, there's a lot more to discuss with March. We are limited by time today, unfortunately. So I'm just going to say, in the case of 5-inch movement things like Moria Goblins, March is possibly less important when you have the shooting advantage. If you can force your opponent onto you, then you can afford to pick where on the battlefield you're going to have the main fight. But with goblins, you generally will never have shooting advantage. Because even I've done experimental lists, I've written them up where I would just have like a front line of normal goblins or prowlers, and then all of the spears also have bows up to the bow limit. And even in like a 700-point list, and I've got like 22 shots, and I'm thinking, yeah, but range 18 and hitting on 5s at best and strength 2. It's a nuisance threat, but it's not necessarily going to outshoot a lot of stuff at the equivalent points level, so it can almost be a waste. I find it's usually always better to have shields on spears. Now, I thought the goblins require March, because there are loads of scenarios where you're either 24 inches apart when you start, or there's Maelstrom, so there's that potential. But Barney does incredibly well at GBHL events with no March at all. And I would quite be interested to have a chat with him at some stage to say, well, how do you get around this? Because when I play like Lords of Battle and your opponent's got a big shooting advantage and they deploy at the back of the board and it's all about getting the kill tally, whatever, you need to close down that gap as fast as possible. And the 2 might that you spend on your captain for March to get the extra 6 inches worth of movement can quite often be the difference between losing 2 to 4 models or so, and that can be a huge swing in Lords of Battle. Nowadays, I'm not so sure. Because Moria has mobility in absolute spades. You have all the monsters, you have the marauders, you have the bat swarms. So in terms of sort of just reaching objectives and things, you don't really struggle. So the only thing March is really that useful for in that list is closing down the distance on enemies that have the shooting superiority. I didn't take a captain to last weekend because I wanted to do fun stuff I don't know, so I did a Black Shield Shaman instead, which is hit and miss, because in the first game I used it, it was up against Return of the King. So you've either got King of the Dead, or with 6 will, you've got Herald of the Dead with resistance to magic. You've got Legolas, who's got 2 swords, so if you shatter one, doesn't matter. You got Aragorn, if you shatter Anduril, then he's got a normal sword, according to the strict letter of the law. So
he's also got like 3 will and a 3 points of minus as well to resist it with.
So you're just not gonna. So basically, I got it a bit confused, I'll be honest, because I remembered explicitly that it said you cannot shatter living things, and I thought that was their kind of get out clause to say you can't shatter, Farmer Maggot's dogs, Radagast's bunnies, or horses, or wargs, or whatever.
No, it's just
cruel man.
Yeah, so I looked at his Riders of the Dead and said, well, your horses aren't alive, I'm shattering them. And then it turned out, actually, we read it after the game, it said mounts in general. So potentially what I should have done is just shattered their weapons and made his cavalry a bit toothless. But a bit of accidental cheating going on there. And the reason that I'm saying about, because I had no March because I had the Gundabad Shaman, and then in one of the games I was playing all-mounted Minas Tirith, and he was kiting me the whole time, because obviously he moves 5 inches and shoot, I move 5 inches in total. And the only way you can get around that is just sort of send the bat or the warg after them, and then they just mug it and kill it. But I found that was less of an issue because I had the Watcher. So I was like, okay, you keep backing away. I'm going to bring this huge octopus up behind you. So I've got play testing left to do, and I haven't touched Lake Town at all this year. But I'm looking at them potentially and thinking you need mobility so much more with the new scenarios that actually, do you take the militia captain? Do you take Hilda or something of that nature?
Or ally in some Mine Hills, Goat Riders or something.
Yeah.
I think where an army doesn't have any access to cavalry, Because in the army of Lake Town, you literally only got 2 mounted heroes, which is Bard and Gandalf. And so I think as well, if we assume with the new scenarios, there's going to be more of an incline towards a mounted portion in your opponent's army, or considering how much love Rohan's got in the last few Legendary Legions, there's a lot of options to running all mounted Rohan. So I think if you've got an army with very, very limited access to cavalry, I think you are going to want to make sure you've got a couple of heroes with March just to counter it, because especially if you get a scenario where it's all about movement, if your opponent can easily outmaneuver you, you need to have a counter to that. So it's probably worth taking 1 or 2 captains. I mean, if you're taking a goblin army, considering that goblins are not expensive, like once you've paid for the basic heroes, once you've paid for like your monsters and things, you're still going to have room for at least 1 or 2 captains. So you're going to have that March to fall back on. So I think especially if you're doing, I think where March comes in really, really handy is with the Horde armies, because with an army like that, it's all about movement. Not everything is going to benefit from heroic marches. Not everything is going to benefit from heroic moves, just because everything has to be spread out so much. Essentially, it adds extra mobility to your Horde army. I think that's another scenario where it comes in handy.
Well, Lake Town does have usually a shooting superiority with or without Gandalf's blinding light, so that does help in terms of pulling your opponent to you. But I think the game's more complicated than just simply who's going to move in to fight, who's not going, because now you've got so much in terms of moving around the board to think about. So it's an exciting time, and then we're sort of going to have to move swiftly on. But in a future thing, we could have a look at where you would combine marching with being able to shoot and being able to combine it with a drum. So Reese has got quite good success with cataphracts with drums, and if you got like Malher's Marauders, you can potentially combine a drum and a heroic march to get up to a 14-inch moving Uruk-hai, which is really grisly. And actually, if you were playing like Uruk-hai against goblins, for example, and you beating the drum every turn, then potentially you can be moving 5.5 inches and shooting while the goblins are running after you at 5 inches going, oh, Jesus, we're never going to get there. Yeah. But in terms of marching, we're going to look at the Elven faction, lastly, just before we move on to the lore dive. And this is one of the armies, as we were discussing, or just in general, one of the races, that would be the word to look for, that struggles to have access to march outside of the general captains. So looking at Rivendell, the only marches there are the High Elf Captain and Gildor Inglorian. Looking at Lothlorien, again, it's only the captains. And in terms of Thranduil's halls, none of Legolas, Tauriel, or Thranduil have march. So, either of you, because I've only played Elves the once, at a 500-point event where I had Glorfindel and Círdan. So that basically meant I had, the numbers to sort of say, you're coming to me, because I got Blinding Light and 6 elf bows. So that wasn't really that much of an issue. And Glorfindel with the 12-inch horse means that he can zip around and nick the objectives and things. So in terms of playing Elves for either of you, because Sam, you've got Thranduil's halls, how do you deal with the mobility issue?
I just brought loads of bows, which can get like a Mirkwood Ranger like unit if you want, with like Legolas or Tauriel. Thranduil, put him on his elk, because even though he's better on foot, you can still get that charge off. Some people have been telling me like this thing of like you can dismount him whilst he's in combat, but I'm pretty sure that's not the case.
No.
Do not listen to the bad man.
Yeah, people told me this, and I was just saying like this does not sound right to me. If you're being attacked, you would not have time to dismount off your horse. So, whoa, hang on, let me just get down and draw me a sword.
No, people did that to me. That's where it came from. So I had Thranduil and the twins, who obviously are better off fighting on foot rather than getting charged while mounted. And so I would charge in, and then my opponents at the gamey tables would be saying, right, I'm going to jump off the horse now. Oh, you can do that.
Yeah.
So
you can dismount and charge into combat, but you can't dismount whilst in combat.
Yeah, I put it on the GBHL and people are going, what? People have been trying to do that to you? That's ridiculous.
Exactly.
I got had.
It's got essentially, like you say, we've got like go for like majority bows, and then you can try shoot out their bows, and as you say, force them to come to you, or just snipe them off objectives they try to take. I've got a couple of Mirkwood cavalry now. I can try and get together at some points and try to use like snatching some objectives or using a bit more mobility. Haven't used them since I believe October last year, but I'll try and get them out again sometime maybe in the summer. I've got my armies written out till probably about June now, so I haven't got any space to use them yet. But
I think as well, this is kind of coming from a lore perspective, in that the elves in the Third Age of Middle Earth don't really go to war. They're kind of nearly all kind of like the powerful elven heroes. Elrond, nearly said Gil-galad, he's dead. No, so yeah, Elrond, Glorfindel, Erestor, and then characters like Galadriel, Celeborn. They don't really fight. They just live in the Elven realms. I mean, obviously Haldir goes off to Helm's Deep, but obviously then when you're in a defensive situation, you're not really going to be doing a lot of marching. And then we know kind of obviously Thranduil, again, he's in the Third Age, he's there fighting in Mirkwood, and they go and attack Dol Guldur. So there's not really, from like a specific theme point, there's not really a lot of call for the elves to be fighting. So that might be why quite a lot of the heroes don't have march. And again, in like someone like Gildor, they're kind of their exiles, they're leaving Middle Earth, and so it kind of, it's the idea that they're marching away from Middle Earth, so they're just stray wanderers. But yeah, like we said, with the elven lists, the majority of times you take elves, you're going to be taking a lot of firepower. You're not going to be going. You're going to go for a movement heavy army. You're going to kind of try and get as many bows into the army as possible. And with all the elven armies like Mirkwood, Lothlorien, Rivendell, they've all got access to cavalry as well. And so you kind of you're not really going to be in a. You're going to be focused more about shooting your opponent with archery, and then you're going to try and probably send in the cavalry to mop them up. I mean, so especially if you got Elrond with his like Wrath of Ruin in, you charge him in, do that, and then everyone's on the floor, and then the cavalry charges in. I think it's more of a case of they've got enough versatility that they don't really need to worry about not having extra movements, because they can kind of deal with it well enough on their own.
So if you've got Rivendell, you can have Círdan with Blinding Light. If you've got Lothlorien, you've got Galadriel with Blinding Light. If you've got Thranduil's Halls and your opponent has a Mordor Catapult, on a scale of 1 to 10, how screwed exactly are you?
It's all right, because you've got terror, and that will, oh dear.
Until the catapult lands on Thranduil's head directly.
Yeah, that's a small issue. That might be one of those times where you might need to just throw caution to the wind and, go up to them. I do tend to include a captain in by Thranduil's Halls, so like usually the Palace Guard captain, because I figure if he's within 3 inches of Thranduil, he's suddenly gets fight 7, and that's pretty decent for like someone who's like 70 points ish. And
so which hero do you sacrifice at that point? Do you do, because I would, if I was going for funsies, would want Thranduil, Legolas, and Tauriel. Which of those is sort of the most expendable to you?
Might be a bit controversial, but I might get rid of Legolas, because I quite like to have a nice combat-y army. So Tauriel, what's got you throw into the thick of it, and it's like, yes, you can surround her if you like, but see how well that goes.
Well, Legolas now has a new lease of life because of assassination. So suddenly everybody's going, oh my god, Legolas is amazing at this scenario. But if the first thing they do is auto hit one of your guys with Legolas and assassination, you just, all right, I'm going to hide that guy behind a bush.
That's where you throw out red herrings. That's where you throw out red herrings or do a double bluff.
Yeah.
You can shoot at someone who's not your target, freak them out, make them hide, and then that's just one guy out of your way. you could target the one you are targeting, cause a double bluff. I think, well, maybe he's doing that to do a red herring, so that guy might not be the target, and then you just mind fuck them. Thing is, which got like on the flips, like it's basically the exact opposite of like your point of which got like I feel safe bringing Moria because it's a lot less likely the contest champions are coming up. Assassination is exactly the same odds of coming up as well, so it's not necessarily worth worrying about. It's something to consider, but it's not necessarily you change your entire army based around the possibility of getting 1 in 18 chance scenario.
No, although Legolas's ability to take away mounts on the 5+ on a 2+ hit is still pretty gnarly with the might points. But if Tauriel doing the knife fighter thing is how you prefer to play, that's absolutely fine. Actually, I think the guard captain idea is really good because then you get the fight 7 captain and you got the march in there. Sorry,
and
James,
put a shield on him as well, and something you can just have a nice perfect roadblock, and you have hold up the likes of Aragorn.
But yeah, that's kind of with the new scenarios. It's got a lot harder to tailor a list that can do all 18. It's kind of in theory it was the same back when we had the original 12 scenarios. You had certain armies that worked in several scenarios, but then they didn't work in other scenarios, and it's still the same now. You can have an army that's really, really strong in one particular scenario. So like in a scenario where it's all about movement, it's going to be very, very favourable to cavalry options. But then in games where it's all about killing the opponent, a horde army is going to have, again, a horde army is going to be really, really good at objective-based games. But when it's all about killing the enemy, it's going to be worse for a horde army because it's got more kill points to give away. So it kind of where an army is strong in one scenario, it's not evenly balanced, but the scale sort of swings depending on the scenario. But there's no de facto you take this particular list, it's going to win every single scenario. There's nothing like that anymore. It's
also partially down to just luck of what opponents you get. The one time I've won a tournament, I got against Moria in Contest Champions. I got, I think the toughest game I got was Return of the King in Lords of Battle, or To the Death, something along those lines. Third game, I think I got Iron Hills against my Gundabad, with Bowl and all that sort of thing. In, I think, the opposite, so it's our Lords of Battle To the Death. I was able to kill Thorin very quickly with Bowl. And the last game, and I was told, well, as long as you don't lose this like 10-0 or worse, you've basically won it outright. And then I got Thorin's Company in Domination. And it was like, oh, okay. So, it's partially just down to the luck of what you get up against in what scenario.
So the pool system also, I think, is absolutely fantastic because now it means I don't go into a tournament thinking, oh, okay, I could get 2 Maelstrom and also Reconnoiter, so I should probably have Lurtz or Gurits or something. And it means that I'm not going to have Lords and Contest and To the Death all in the same tournament anymore. So actually goblins are a bit more viable, and I think I've mentioned on the podcast before, but the one thing I like above everything else is that no longer means that you must have a giant killy beatstick hero. It means you can do Galadriel leading Lothlorien, the Dark Marshal leading Mordor, Saruman leading Isengard. You're going to see a lot more variety of armies now, which is terrific. Elves, yes. So Thranduil's Halls. It's such a pity now that Thranduil's Halls can't just take on a Lake Town militia captain with Alfred supporting for a cheeky 5 might marching airdrop. Although with the current rules as it is, you can just have a cheap militia captain to get access to March if that's what you've got options for. So with that in mind, we're going to move swiftly to James as we take up a position by the fireside. I've just been mugged by my cat, who is now sat in my lap purring away. So we're going to sit and listen to James explain the story of the elves.
Yes, well, I'm not going to go into absolutely tons of detail. So the one thing I'm going to say, otherwise this could literally take hours. The one thing I'm going to say straight away, if you want to know the major backstory of the elves and their origins and everything like that, the best thing you can do is read the Silmarillion. This is essentially, it's the entire history of the creation of the creation of Middle Earth, the creation of the elves, and everything that happens as a result. But to kind of give you a brief history, like a very brief, succinct history. So essentially, it starts with the creation of the world, and the elves are like they're the first people to wake up in this new world. It's been created by the Valar, and they essentially say to the elves, "We've come up with this really nice island called Valinor. So for like all the immortal creatures of Middle Earth, we've created this place for you to live." And so they say, "Come with us, come journey to this island." And so you've got 3 main factions of elves as they make their long journey to Valinor. So you've got you get elves that as they make their journey, they reach forests, and there are certain elves that they walk amongst the trees. They really like living amongst the trees, so they decide to stay living amongst the trees, and these become the Sylvan elves. So this is the origins of the wood elves. So this is kind of like that's the origin of the wood elves. Essentially, they walk through the woods. They really like the woods. They said, "Oh, we're going to live in the woods." So the elves continue their long journey westwards, and eventually they get to the sea. And some of them are like, "Oh, we really like it here. We're going to live by the sea." So they like build their ships and they build their havens, like the Grey Havens and things like that, and they become the Sindarin elves, which is basically they're the sea elves, and this is where Círdan comes from. So he's kind of like Círdan is probably the oldest living elf in the whole like Middle Earth story. Like he's been there from the absolute beginning. So, but yeah, his people are the ones that they live by the sea and they build ships and they do all that sort of thing. And so you're left with the final faction, the one that goes all the way to Valinor, and they are called the Noldor. And the Noldor are essentially, they're the main race of elves. So kind of that's where the characters like Fëanor comes from. Fëanor is the one who creates the Silmarils. They're stolen by Melkor, and kind of like Fëanor then basically in his rage renames him Morgoth, which means the Black Foe. And so basically, the Noldor essentially race back to Middle-earth in pursuit of Morgoth and the Silmarils because they're trying to get them back. But then kind of what follows is kind of there's a lot of the problems with the elves. Like, elves in the Third Age of Middle-earth are quite peaceful and only like go to war when it's absolutely necessary. Whereas elves in the First Age, they will literally just fight over anything. So what essentially happens is the Noldor go to the Sindar elves and basically say, "We want your ships, we haven't got time for this," and they basically fight them for them. So as a result, quite a lot of elves get killed by other elves, and the Valinor, the Valar exile the Noldor from Valinor. So that's why in the books, that's essentially why Gildor and Glorian can upgrade to exiles, which gives them the extra movement. So that's essentially that's what their people are, like the last of the Noldor that are still in Middle Earth. And so the Noldor basically get back to Middle Earth, and they build the great big cities like Gondolin and that sort of thing. And so over like the next God knows how many years, the elves fight the wars against Morgoth and his creatures to kind of to try and reclaim the Silmarils, and that essentially leads to the whole, like, you're introduced to the deeds of Beren and Luthien and recovering the Silmaril from Morgoth's crown, and then that kind of leads into the whole situation, and eventually you get Elrond and Elros emerge out of the whole thing. But yeah, a lot of the lore of the elves is contained in the Silmarillion. So that's kind of that's the best place that explains like the origins of the elves and basically covers all of that. But then like when you get to the Second Age, you've kind of still got the Noldor with Gil-galad and Elrond and the Forging of the Rings and the War of the Last Alliance. That's all the Noldor. I think Lothlorien gets involved to some extent in the Last Alliance, because we know that Thranduil's father gets killed in the War of the Last Alliance, but we don't. That's not really expanded on in any detail. I mean, there's the potential that they go there with the Amazon series, but we generally don't know that just yet. But yeah, and then by the time of the Third Age, obviously after 3 ages of fighting, first with Morgoth and then with Sauron's forces, like the elves are quite like elven numbers have been very, very diminished. So kind of like by then there is Mirkwood, there's Lothlorien, there's Rivendell, and then there's the Grey Haven. So that's kind of like the only really those are the only like elven like the elven realms in Middle Earth at that point, which is why a lot of the elves are now leaving Middle Earth and going west over the sea. So yeah. So basically to summarize, elven lore is really, really complicated, but yeah, it's all found in the Silmarillion. So this is basically an advert for the Silmarillion. That is kind of like it's the official history of Middle Earth, and I can honestly recommend it. It's a really, really good read, and it kind of, you sort of see where like how certain characters in the Lord of the Rings are almost, they're not exactly carbon copies of the like characters in the Silmarillion, but you can basically see a lot of similarities. Like there are similar like epic battles, there are similar deeds done by great heroes and minor heroes, and so it's kind of you can kind of see where like the influences came from. So yeah, so that's kind of like a very, very, very brief history of elven lore. But like I said, you could literally sit and talk for hours just going through like the various stories and things, and we could potentially do that in another episode of this podcast. There's an awful lot of lore of Lord of the Rings. I mean, for example, a future podcast we could look at maybe the dwarves as well. There's a good rich history to the dwarves, and so we could do a focus on them. You could look at men as well. You could look at the origins of the hobbits. So yeah, this lovely little lore series that we started out by looking at the Gondor at War profiles and how heroes from the books that didn't end up in the films have then been added to the game. And so yeah, there's a lot more potential for this series. So stay tuned in the future.
What happens to Thranduil in the Fourth Age? Does he go into the West as well?
We don't actually know. The story in the Fourth Age of Middle Earth is not a lot written about it. The only real focus for the Fourth Age is kind of on like what happens to the Fellowship. So obviously Sam basically gets selected mayor of the Shire for about 6 or 7 times. And then he goes over the sea to join Frodo. Merry and Pippin grow up to become like the leaders of Buckland and Tookland, and then they go off to Gondor where they live out the last of their days. And then when Aragorn eventually dies at the age of about 250 years old, I think he is when he eventually dies, Legolas and Gimli also sail over the seas. So it's kind of like once Aragorn dies, Legolas and Gimli leave Middle Earth as well. So that's kind of, it's like with the passing of Aragorn, that's the end. And like the way it just finishes, and it ends with like the little line, "Thus pass the days of the Fellowship of the Ring in Middle Earth."
Because Gimli not supposed to go to Valinor, but Legolas is like, "I'm smuggling my pet in through customs." So.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I think Legolas basically. Gimli was the only dwarf to travel to the Undying Lands. So
what was Galadriel doing during the War of the Last Alliance? Because you see her banish the Necromancer quite happily in The Hobbit, and then you think, what were you doing in the Last Alliance and then during the War of the Ring? War of the Ring, she was involved in the war in the north, in the appendices, etc. She tears down Dol Guldur. But where was she in the Last Alliance?
The simple answer to that is we don't know. There's an awful lot of unwritten story to Lord of the Rings. Like the Second Age is the kind of the second age of Middle Earth is one of the few things that Tolkien doesn't really write about, never really wrote about. You've kind of got, like I said, the Silmarillion deals with the first age of Middle Earth. Then it deals with like the downfall of Numenor and kind of the events of the second age and like the forging of the One Ring. He does a little bit on like the rings of like the forging of the rings of power and like how Sauron deceives the elves by learning the craft of ring making and forging the One Ring. But when it actually gets to events of the second age, there's really not a lot, which is kind of, I think, why, again, going on to the Amazon series, I think this is why. So the simple answer for like where is Galadriel during the War of the Last Alliance, we honestly don't know. The best speculation is she is hanging out somewhere in Lothlorien, but so don't. I think quite possibly because they wanted to hide the 3 Elven rings from Sauron, so they obviously wanted to make sure that obviously he's put on he wears the One Ring. He's already taken the 9 rings that were made for men, and there's also concern about the 7 dwarf rings. But I think she's hiding in Lothlorien because they don't want him to get his hands on the 3 Elven rings.
Is it the 3 in total? Because you've already sent. Who would have them at that stage? Círdan's debatably not there. Gil-galad's got one of them. So it's just like, oh, we'll risk you, Círdan. But Galadriel's pulling up a deck chair in Lothlorien, getting the popcorn out, going, you guys got this.
Yeah. By the time of the War of the Last Alliance, Elrond should have the second one of the 2 Elven rings. I think Círdan has the Ring of Fire because he gives that to Gandalf when Gandalf arrives in Middle Earth, and then
he's got the Johnny Cash ring. Yep. Yeah.
So Galadriel's got the Ring of Water. Elrond, we know, has the Ring of Air, but it's not alluded to. It's not alluded to in the story if Elrond actually uses the ring during the War of the Last Alliance. Again, it's probably unlikely because if you don't want Sauron to get his hands on the ring, you wouldn't have someone at the middle of the action wearing it. So I think it probably wasn't used in the War of the Last Alliance. It was probably hidden safely in Rivendell.
So you say Círdan is the oldest elf in Middle-earth, but there's a popular meme that goes around every now and then with all the different characters in Lord of the Rings saying, "Oh, that's cute. I'm this old." Galadriel and Treebeard are supposedly older than the moon, aren't they? In this story.
Yeah, I think Círdan and Galadriel are probably 2 of the oldest ones. The origins of the Ents are not dealt with much. There's a reference to them in the Silmarillion, but not a lot of backstory to the Ents. But yeah, Galadriel is probably the same age as Círdan, but obviously she doesn't have a beard, so she obviously has a much better morning routine than Círdan. So, although strangely, the Círdan model doesn't have a beard, so that's a weird one.
No. And the last thing I had written down while I was listening to your story was Saruman's diatribe of, do you know how the orcs came into being? And he says they were elves once. And I'm thinking he can't mean every single orc that we see was once an elf, because there's thousands of them. So I presume it's referring back to some kind of original tale where the gods are making the creatures and they go, we're going to take this one elf, we're going to corrupt it into this orc, and now the orc's going to breed. Is that the idea? That's pretty much. The first orcs were originally elves that Morgoth essentially took and tortured and mutilated. And he created the first orcs, and they were bred from them. So that was kind of he bred them in the thousands. So they were kind of. It's kind of like orcs were made in mockery of elves, trolls were made in mockery of Ents. So that's the main origins there. But yeah, the first orcs were mutated elves. Mm-hmm. Who did the mutating? Was it Morgoth?
It was Morgoth, yes.
Radio.
Didn't know the yellow Ent thing there. That's cool.
Yeah, this is why we keep James in our basement and we let him out to entertain us with his information.
You only bring me out for pub quizzes, yeah.
And so moving on to the listeners' Q&A, we have James on tap. So we decided people can write in and ask what is the backstory on their favourite hero profiles from the SBG. And so Sam has got it open because he's organised, unlike me. So Sam, take it away for your segment, please.
Okay. So this is completely not fixed. The first one is from me, Azog and Bolg.
Okay, so 2 characters with very, very little backstory. Azog is introduced in The Hobbit in a single line that he killed Thror's grandfather. That's it. And then in the appendices, in the end of The Return of the King, Azog essentially is introduced as a big orc chieftain that essentially took over Moria whilst it was abandoned. So Thror journeys into Moria, and kind of after a few days, like with one of his companions, after a few days, Thror's body is basically thrown out along with Thror's head, and essentially he's warned by Azog not to come in. So obviously the dwarves are considerably outraged by the desecration of the body of their king, and so starts a long bloody war between the dwarves and the orcs, culminating in the Battle of Dimril Dale, where in The Hobbit, Azog emerges as this great big Gundabad orc that wants to wipe out the line of Durin, and then Thorin cuts his arm off and Azog becomes a main protagonist in the Hobbit films. But in the actual book, it's not Thorin who chops off Azog's arm. Dane arrives and kills Azog. So, yeah, what essentially happens is the dwarves start the battle early on, and then the orc numbers kind of start to overwhelm them. The dwarves get driven back, and then the Iron Hills arrive, and essentially it rallies the dwarves. They push them back to the very gates of Moria. Azog emerges at last and basically fights with Nain II, who is Dane's father, but more on that in a second. And then Dane leaps after Azog and then cuts him down right before the gates of Moria. And so kind of the dwarves win the battle. The orcs are pretty much purged from Moria, but the dwarves don't enter Moria because they can sense the presence of the Balrog. And so they're kind of they don't enter. So yeah, so that's the origins of Azog. And then again, Bolg, again, very, very little backstory. He's introduced in The Hobbit in the Battle of Five Armies. He's Azog's son. And so essentially, whilst everything's going on with Thorin's company and the journey to the Lonely Mountain, they're amassing a great big goblin army in Mount Gundabad, and they kind of sweep down from the north, and they arrive at the Battle of the Five Armies, and basically eventually it goes on, and Beorn arrives, breaks through Bolg's bodyguard, and crushes him completely. So, yeah, Bolg and Azog are two characters whose stories are expounded upon a lot more in the Hobbit films. I mean, yeah, Bolg is still introduced as Azog's son, but he's given a bit more of a prominent role, and then he's obviously finished off when Legolas goes into Super Mario mode and sticks his knife through his head. So
yes,
and then you got the Azog and Thorin, and Thorin sacrifices himself to defeat Azog. So yeah, they're two heroes who are prominent in terms of the Hobbit, and so their roles and profiles were expanded upon in the films and the game, which is quite good. So to give them a bit more. To give them a bit more prominence and like the primary antagonists. So that's the origins of Azog and Bolg. So
is that why Iron Hills are green allies with Army of Thror in SBG?
Probably.
I never got that. I thought they were like different ages.
Yes. If you wanted to fight the Battle of Dimril Dale from the original perspective, you could do it that way. You
said Thror's grandfather. Did you mean Thorin's grandfather, as in Thror? Was the one that was
Thror is Thorin's grandfather. Yeah, my mistake.
Yep, cool.
Okay. Next up is Jake Robson with Imrahil and Fatty, who I assume is Forlong. And also...
No, it's Fatty Bolger. Has to be. No context.
It's only because then he says also Dween here and Angbor.
Yeah.
So that'd be my logic.
I would assume if he said Fatty, he means Forlong the Fat. So, yeah. So, again, these characters are not really expand upon. Forlong, Angbor, and Dunhir are all lords of various regions in southern Gondor, so the fiefdoms. So Forlong is the lord of Losanach, Angbor is the lord of Lamadon, and Dunhir is the lord of Morthond. And these are all like provinces in southern Gondor, and they all commit troops to join in the siege of Gondor. So Forlong brings a load of axemen. Dunhir brings a load of bowmen, and then Angbor, it kind of he's helping defend Pelagia when Aragorn arrives with the army of the dead. So that basically happens. They take the Corsair ships, and then Aragorn, the Dunedain, the Elven twins. Again, this is all based on the book. They go sail up the Anduin with reinforcements, and basically Angbor follows on foot later on in the story. And I think it's he basically then brings additional forces to command the defense of Minas Tirith whilst everyone's fighting at the Black Gate. Mm-hmm. And then going on to Imrahil, he is the Lord of Dol Amroth. Again, Dol Amroth gets a little bit more backstory in like the Silmarillion. Basically, Dol Amroth is originally in southern Gondor, but it was originally an elven settlement, and kind of as the years go on, the elves of Dol Amroth mingle with the Númenóreans, and so Prince Imrahil actually has elven lineage in his blood.
Oh my god!
So I think that kind of explains the fact that he's one of the few Fight 6 heroes that is not tied into Númenor in either way. I think there was kind of like an initial chat that like all the only Fight 6 plus heroes are because they've got the blood of Númenor, and Imrahil is one of those reasons. So there's kind of like there's elven ancestry in the lineage of Dol Amroth. But again, this is it's slightly expanded upon in things like the Silmarillion. So you can learn a bit more there, and it's alluded to in the book Return of the King when Legolas acknowledges that the Prince of Dol Amroth has elven blood. So that's Imrahil.
So what's Boromir's excuse for having Fight 6 then?
Because he's a badass.
Yeah.
He's literally because he's an absolute badass in the game in the film and in the game and in the book. So he's a valiant leader of Gondor. So I think it's because of his valor and his deeds that he gets Fight 6.
Mm-hmm. Also, I suppose he did fight against all the Uruk-hai. He didn't really take any wounds unless he was shot. So fair enough.
Exactly.
Happy to move on.
Yep.
Well, actually, I was going to chip in with. I remember the quiz we did at Ardacon the other year, and one of the questions was. How do Dunhir's son, or Dunhir and his son, die at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields? And James just shouts out across the hall, "Old age!" Got quite a decent laugh out of that. Right, what's the next question?
This is our new number one elf fan, Tom Hawker.
Woo.
He says he thinks the obvious answer here is that James Wilson tell us about marching male kings. Well, non-existent, so done.
Yeah, they can't.
But in all seriousness, I'd like to know a little more about Nain, other than Zog killed him, or is that all we're allowed to know?
In fairness, that is pretty much it. Nain II is the Lord of the Iron Hills who leads the dwarves at the Battle of Dimril Dale, and something like they're the ones that drive the orcs back to Moria. And at the end of it all, Nain basically confronts Azog. The difference, however, is Azog hasn't been doing any fighting. Nain has spent the entire battle fighting and is exhausted. So, yeah, eventually Azog kills Nain, but then
what's a hero?
Obviously Dane leaps after him. Azog kind of realizes, haha, I killed the Dwarf King, but basically, oh dear, all my orcs are getting completely pulverized. I'm going to leg it, and at that point, Dane Ironfoot leaps after him in true Billy Connolly, ya buggers style. He could have done. Mm. And then basically, catches Azog before the gates of Moria and kills him. So, that's Nain's backstory. Also, this is where I like to think, this is where Tolkien's being very clever with his language, because Nain, spelt Nain, is actually the French word for dwarf. So his name literally means dwarf.
French.
You dwarf the dwarf. Okay.
He's literally, he is dwarf the dwarf, which is just basically. So little fluff point for you here. Tolkien absolutely loved languages. You can probably tell that when you read things like Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, but he loved languages. So he liked to put in a few tricks and things like that. So that's Nain, the Dwarf King. So that's him done.
That's great.
Okay. Next one is Tom Smith, who has just done a picture of a big bear going rah, which I assume is Beorn.
Beorn, again, most of his backstory is in The Hobbit. He's a skin changer, which means he can change his skin, so he can change from a man into a bear. And yeah, he's believed to have like it says in the Hobbit, he's believed to have descended from like a group of changeling people that dwell in the mountains before the orcs arrive, and it's kind of it's alluded to in the Hobbit that he is the last of his kind, but then by the events of Lord of the Rings, he has a son, which is Grimbeorn and the Beornings. So there's obviously more of those people, but it's not. Again, it's something that's not really expanded upon by Tolkien. There's a lot of stuff in like Tolkien's writings that you kind of only have one reference to it, and then it's not alluded to further. For example, in the Silmarillion, there's references to werewolves, and at one point Sauron becomes a vampire, which is again not alluded to at all afterwards. So there's kind of there's a lot of untold story in Lord of the Rings and in Middle Earth in general. So there's kind of that's Beorn. He is a mysterious character, and that kind of lends more to him.
Is the Sauron vampire the basis for Gulliver, or is that just a complete?
Oh well, that's it's entirely possible. It could be an inspiration for it, but yeah, the simple answer is I simply don't know, because there's so much untold story. That kind of helps when you're that probably helps people like Rob and Jay when they're coming up with ideas for profiles. It's kind of, I think as long as you can get this like the aesthetic right, people are going to go say, yeah, you know what, that character fits in. They're kind of like there's a lot of like untold story. So you could potentially say, well, yeah, no, that could have happened, or so that might be something they need to consider when they're writing a profile. It's kind of like, so would this have happened? And yeah, it's plausible. And so you kind of, if it's in the realms of plausibility, it probably would work. If they go like, no, that doesn't fit in with the story. So that probably might be an influence when they come up with these profiles. They need to think, does that belong in the story? So
what we want now from Games Workshop is a War in the North kind of book where they have the Grimbeorns. You can have like Berserker Rage on the Beornings. See, I always thought that Beorn must have like found a human wife or something from Lake Town, and so the kids are sort of half, and so because it's never specified whether they can become bears as well, but they would potentially still have that kind of.
Yeah, there's a lot of open story to work with there, which is a good thing, especially when you're writing a game profile.
So is Beorn still alive at the time of the War of the Ring?
We assume no, because we assume he's dead and his son now leads those people. There's no reference to there's a kind of like brief reference to like the Beorn of old, which suggests that Beorn is no longer around. But again, it kind of his lifespan is not alluded to. We don't know how old Beorn is. We don't know how old his people lived to. So yeah, there's a lot of like completely open story there. We just literally don't know.
Well, we want the next one with King Brand, and we want werewolves, and we want Beornings. Make it happen, yeah. Rob and Jay.
So next one is Cameron with how many Witch Kings there are in the Not GT. Surely that needs a mention.
This will be a long one, won't it?
Well, actually no, because there's not a lot of backstory to the Ring Wraiths.
Really?
All we know is they used to be great kings of men, and then Sauron deceived them by giving them 9 rings of power, and basically he took those and he took them under his sway because there's 2 named ring wraiths in the entire story of Middle Earth. There's the Witch King and there's Camul the Easterling, but we don't know anything about the origins of the ring wraiths yet. So we know that whilst Sauron's been defeated kind of like several thousand years after the fall of Sauron, and we think it's the Watchful Peace. Basically, the Witch King arrives in Angmar, and obviously that's where he gets his title from. Surprise, surprise. And basically then wages war against the Dunedain and the North Kingdom that ultimately results in its destruction. So kind of like it's interesting in the story of Middle Earth. You've kind of got evil magical creatures that kind of are servants to a greater evil. So it's kind of like you had the Witch King destroy the entirety of Arnor, but he's merely a servant of Sauron, and Sauron obviously waged war across Middle Earth, and if it weren't for the Last Alliance, he wouldn't have. He would have basically conquered everything, and he contributed to the downfall of Numenor as well. And then you've got Sauron was merely a servant of Morgoth, who essentially laid waste to Middle Earth, and if not for the intervention of the Valar, would have completely dominated all of Middle Earth. So it's kind of like so like the chain of command essentially goes Morgoth, Sauron, Witch King. So that's how that works.
Is it written somewhere that the Witch King is definitely a Numenor king?
If there is, I've not read it. We just literally the ring wraiths are aptly completely shrouded in mystery. We don't know anything of their origins. So yeah. So
the Games Workshop thing where they've done a unique spin on each of the 9 ring wraiths, is that based on anything beyond the Witch King and Camul? Because they're not given. So you presume the Knight of Umbar was a Umbar king betrayed.
The named ring wraiths are completely inventions of GW.
But the Dwemer Lake name is something that Eowyn calls the Witch King in the book.
Yes.
Does that mean something specific?
It could be like the Rohirric name for like Wraith or Witch King or something like that. I don't. Again, it's kind of one of those we just don't know. Because there's so much untold story, which again is clearly an influence behind some of the profiles.
2 things, which I've seen lots of hot debates on the internet in the past about who the Witch King's real identity, and it was like some people saying it could be like this king called Tar something or other. And the second part is something I believe you mentioned before, I think in podcasts, which is like Gothmog in the books isn't actually specified to be an orc or anything, so it's a potential he could be like a 3rd ring wraith.
Yeah, that one's been debated quite a lot. Again, the simple answer is we just don't know. It says like Gothmog is kind of like he's second in command to the Witch King, so it's kind of he could be a ring wraith, he could be an orc. We literally just don't know. There's so much ambiguity around it. In the films, they made him into an orc. So,
do you want to move on?
Watcher in the Water. That was my one from the weekend. The Watcher that I christened Admiral Snack Bar. He just appears in the book, I presume, as a literary device to mean that the Fellowship has to go through Moria once they reach there.
Pretty much. There's no backstory to the Watcher in the Water whatsoever. Like the only time it appears in the story is the tentacles coming out of the water. It's only in the film that it gets a physical appearance. In the books, it's just tentacles. So yeah, there's actually nothing else, and it's kind of, and Gandalf just alludes to it, kind of like there are older and fouler things than orcs in the deep places of the world, and that's it.
I seem to recall though when the Balrog is climbing out of the underground jacuzzi. And it says, it's covered in slime and it's horrible. And then it actually has a passage about, and Gandalf could see Watchers sort of squiddling away from it in terror. So it implies that the Watcher is not the only one.
Yeah, and again, it's a completely untold story.
We've got 2 from Josh here. I think it's part of the same thing. Some knowledge about Dalamir and Suladan, please, and their rise to power in their respective provinces.
Dalamir is a completely fictional character. He's completely been invented purely for the game. There's no reference to a fleet master of Umbar or anything like that in the entirety of the story. The only real references to Umbar are kind of during the Third Age, when the Lords of Umbar rebelled against Gondor in what's known as the Kinstrife, which is essentially Numenorians turn on each other, and essentially Gondor is fighting with itself. So, again, but not really alluded to in the story. Suladan is technically a character in the books because there is reference in the Battle of Pelennor Fields to the Serpent Lord with his black serpent on a red field banner, and he's basically. He appears at the start of the Battle of Pelennor Fields, and he's killed by Theoden. But that's it. That's the only backstory we get on the on the Serpent Lord. So his name, Suladan, has been completely invented by Games Workshop, and there's no real backstory to him. He's essentially, he's a character that appears on the Pelennor Fields. He's the leader of the Haradrim, and then Theoden mistakes him for the captain of the armies of Mordor, which is really the Witch King. So Theoden rides down against Suladan and basically, kills him with, I think it's by sticking his spear straight through him. So that kills him. But Suladan he's completely absent from the films. He literally only appears in that very brief passage in the books. So kind of, there's a lot of characters that have a very, very vague reference in the books or films that are then expounded upon in the game. They kind of like they take the basic concepts and then they flesh it out with a profile and like a little bit of a backstory that's then kind of written to make sure it matches the brief description from the books, or then just to make sure it fits in with the theme of the game. So that's kind of how the invented characters work.
So in SBG, the Green Alliance is Haradan and Corsairs, and Josh has said in the past about they retook Umbar together. Do you have any more description of that?
Again, no. It's been fleshed out a bit by GW, but basically what it was, Gondor used to rule the lands of Harad and Umbar and all that. They used to rule that completely, and then essentially the lords of Umbar rebelled against the lords of Gondor, and Umbar fell to the Black Númenóreans, and then they essentially, the Haradrim also rebelled and allied themselves with Mordor, and obviously cue their long marches into Mordor through the Black Gate and through Ithilien, where Frodo and Sam meet Faramir and get introduced to all the Rangers of Gondor. But there's kind of it's a backstory that kind of they take the appendices from the Return of the King, which is covered by the game license, and they take the basics of the story and they expand it. But what's very nice is they've done it in a way that it still fits in with the general theme of Lord of the Rings, which is quite nice. So it's kind of, it didn't actually happen, but the way it's been written, it's a plausible history. So that's kind of where it works quite well.
I find it quite interesting that Corsairs and Mordor are not green in the game, because they clearly had an alliance. They were about to fight together, but then magic ghosties out of nowhere.
The key word there is about to fight together.
Those magic ghosties.
The idea is Umbar is it's a city that's got the Haradrim and the Corsairs of Umbar in it. It's owned by. It's not really owned by them. It's controlled by both of it, which is hence the Corsair and Haradrim alliance.
Similarly, along those lines, is Easterlings and Harad did kind of fight together because they're in the same battle, but they're still yellow. I assume it's more a balancing thing in that sort of idea. In fact, they would have also fought on the Pelennor because of the last stand of the Easterlings. One thing to expand on a bit is we've got the Black Gate and that. You've also got the Cirith Ungol Pass, and I assume there's other little passes in there. Is there any major entrance into Gondor, like the Black Gate, or is that the one and only?
Oh, into Mordor?
Yeah, is there another
the main
south, or?
The main way into Mordor is through the Black Gate, and then obviously there's the secret way through the pass of Cirith Ungol. But the majority of the traffic to Mordor goes through the Black Gate, because obviously you can see Mordor. If you look at like a map of Middle Earth, Mordor is essentially it's walled in on three sides by mountains. So essentially you'd have to. The Black Gate is essentially the easiest way in. Otherwise, you'd have to march all the way around the entire kingdom to entire land of Mordor just to actually get there. So the Black Gate is the single entry into Mordor, and that's essentially probably why Mordor is is pretty much impregnable to assail. You need, like Boromir says, not with 10,000 men could you do this. So essentially, Mordor is basically there's one main way in and one main way out. So that's essentially why it makes Mordor quite a formidable stronghold.
So they should have a little sign outside the Black Gate saying no through road.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, the Black Gate is pretty much a giant no entry sign.
Do you want to move on to the last one?
Yeah, let's do the last profile. See who
This
it
one
is.
might be one CJ might want to answer.
Really?
Tactics for a Morialist, including a Watcher and Drake. Is it ever viable? That's by Tom Smith.
Right. Okay. Is it viable? That sounds like it's more from a game playing perspective.
Yeah.
Are Drakes meant, because we've done Watcher? Are Drakes in the lore at all, or is Games Workshop just gone? That's a good idea. We'll have some of that.
There are references to fire drakes and things like that. Apparently, I think one of the original like dwarf lords of the Iron Hills is actually killed by a cold drake at some point, and and so that then leads to the I think one of the dwarf lords of the Iron Hills is killed by a cold drake, and that essentially then leads to the dwarves getting driven from the northern lands of Middle Earth, and they find their way to the Lonely Mountain and things like that. So I think that's the only real illusion. So there's drakes, there's fire drakes, but yeah, the cave drake is a feasible profile in Lord of the Rings. It does work. So there's references to it, and they've sort of expounded upon that. And the cave drake is a really, really nice model as well. It's got quite a cool profile as well. The fact that it can swallow an opponent whole, that's quite cool.
I've got one thing to bring up is like Smaug's referred to by Dane as a fire drake of the north, isn't he?
He's referred to in the films, yeah. Fire. Well, yeah. Drake and dragon are essentially the same thing. So
he's obviously just a bit bigger than the cave drake profile or model, rather.
Oh, only slightly. Yeah. So the dragon, the actual dragon and the cave drake are very similar in terms of scale. So essentially, like the original dragons in Middle Earth didn't have any wings. It was only after it was like the War of Wrath when the Valar essentially led like the remnants of the elves and men against Melkor. That's when winged dragons first appeared. So I think the idea is a cave drake is essentially it's a wingless dragon, but it can't breathe fire. So that's
basically more of a monster in the deep, isn't it?
Yeah, kind of like that.
It's also worth noting that Smaug is actually fairly tiny compared to some of the other massive ones we were talking about the other day in the group chat, like Glaurung and Calogon the Black, who we still believe is a wizard, but you know.
Smaug is still a threat, but he's still, compared to like the dragons of the First Age, he's tiny. And like Smaug is, I think he's one of like the last few dragons remaining in Middle Earth. So there's kind of, but yeah, Smaug is the only dragon that's kind of referred to in any detail in The Hobbit. The rest of the dragons are all expanded upon in the Silmarillion. So yeah, this little podcast has been a very shameless plug for the Silmarillion. Yeah, if you want to know like the origins and the backstory of a lot of characters and things that are referred to in the Lord of the Rings, you can find them in the Silmarillion. So yeah, that's a good little advert right there. And if you want to, you can find. Again, this is another shameless book. I can recommend the audiobook that you can probably find on like Audible or somewhere like that. It's a really, really good book, and it's actually quite good to listen to as well. If you just like sit there and listen to and immerse yourself in the lore of Middle Earth. So yeah, it's a really good listen.
Yeah, I think the last of surviving dragons are up north in the Grey Wastes or something, aren't they?
Yeah, I should just like to point out to anyone who's listening, I'm not being paid to endorse the audiobook or the Silmarillion. I just really, really like it and can really recommend it.
But you will be contacting the Tolkien family estate and demanding payment for advertising.
Oh yeah, the royalty check should be in the post.
Sweet.
Cha-ching!
In terms of tactics and viability of a cave drake versus a watcher in the water, Drake is an interesting profile. The biggest problem it has is the base. And you might think, a big base is great, I can attack lots of things, but you fight 6, you got no strike, you got 4 attacks, 5 on the charge. In my experience, they're very easy to nullify, basically because you can pin it down with a heroic move, and they don't really have the means to take out a big hero on their own. At least you're going to have to combine it with a bat swarm or summon, at which point you're looking at a 185 points worth of model to do not very much. The Watcher doesn't require the charge bonus, though interestingly, if you're playing in water, it gets monstrous charge, which is just horrendous. That's 7 attacks on the charge and the knockdown bonus, and it moves 8 inches as opposed to the 4 that it's normally stuck with. I was just pulling up. I was basically stalling for time and pulling up their profiles.
Yeah. I've been to loads of tournaments. You don't get an awful lot of terrain that actually had. You don't get a lot of boards that actually have any water terrain.
No,
Usually a late town board, if anything.
Usually, yeah.
So it's different threats. I mean, a Cave Drake has 3 will, Watcher has 5. They both got magic resistance, but it basically means that the Drake is more prone to just getting immobilized out of the game. A Drake is stronger and got better defense than the Watcher. Their strength and defense 7. They both got 6 wounds, both got fight 6, both got 1 might and 1 fate. That's fine. The Watcher, when it gets reduced to 3 wounds or less, goes down to 3 attacks to represent the tentacles getting chopped off. They both have a unique brutal power attack where you can take a man-sized model and basically drown it. Now the Cave Drake has gaping more, so on a 3+, you just swallow it and it's gone. The Watcher can only use the drowning attack if it's partly in water. So, I mean, you could paint up its base as water and say, "Oh, it's always in water," and then the TO will give you a slap. But
that wouldn't go down well from a sporting perspective.
No,
It's going to puzzle the entire game.
You just do like a tiny drop on one of your goblin's bases. You're just like, I'm using that. But what it also then allows you to do is have the Watcher resurface somewhere, which is a great, mobility in that sense is something the Watcher's got over.
So yeah, a tunneling Watcher.
Yeah, it basically does the Battle for Middle-earth 2 thing where suddenly you're just like, oh, I'm going to burst it out the ground. And most people look at the bursting thing where it moves all the models around it and they think, oh, that would be annoying. It's not actually that useful. You can break up a shield wall if you want to, but the size of a Watcher's base and the speed that it moves, you really don't want to plonk it right behind your enemy lines and let it get mugged. Because as I say, fight 6 and no strike, you're just going to get, surrounded and walloped.
Unless you're fighting against me and I roll a 1.
This is true. Now, the Cave Drake has a little bonus about protecting the nest. It gets, within 3 of its nest marker, it gets the Fearless rule. In my experience, you very rarely actually get to use that. What it's more a case of is before the game, you put the thing down and suddenly your opponent goes, I'm not going anywhere near that. So it's a little bit of board control if you want to use it in that way. A Dweller also has Mountain Dweller and Woodland Creature, so you can surprise most opponents by suddenly emerging 8 inches straight through a forest. Or in Sam's case, over a year ago, I have it run down off a mountaintop and run over Legolas when he rolls a 1 on the Elven Blade roll-off. Now, look, what I found is it's the tentacles on the Watcher. So you get not only this ability where you don't deploy it at the start, you do the priority roll, and then you say, do I want it to arrive this turn? You're on a 3+. And then once you've decided I want it to arrive, you then have to roll every turn. You can't just sort of say, okay, no, this turn doesn't suit me. But anyway, it arrives and you can plonk it anywhere. So there are lots of useful things you can do with that. Not the least. I mean, it'd be a hell of a way to win it, but you want to do reconnoiter. You just boing and then move off the board. But it's the tentacles that really make this a big threat. You've got a 6-inch range and a 3+ shoot value. Now it's strength 3 hits. You just get slapped with a tentacle. And then anything that is hit but not slain is dragged straight into base contact with the Watcher. And there are no in the way rolls. So not for your own models, not for it being in combat. 3+, you've got it. Doesn't matter what it is. As long as it's within 6 inches, doesn't matter what it's doing. Now, you can bully the hell out of low tier heroes with this. Oh, you fight 5 with no strike. No, you're lunch now. And it doesn't matter that the Watcher has the piddly Courage 3, which if it's fighting something with Terror or even Harbinger, even worse. Because the Drake's got Courage 4, which is fairly good. It used to have the Survival Instinct. It doesn't anymore, which is nice. But for the Watcher, the Terror thing's not that important, because if you don't get to charge, then you can still shoot in the shoot phase. So you just go, okay, I didn't manage to charge. Well, I'm going to tentacle you now, drag you in. The FAQs have also put in a couple of things like you can shoot the models that you're already engaged with. So you can just whip whatever you're fighting and try and take it out. You whip the tentacle whip. So the chance when you wallop a mounted hero, you're just going to take the horse out from underneath them and then drag them into combat, and then they can't strike because they've had a thrown rider, assuming they don't get a 6. Horses, cavalry doesn't count as charging a Watcher if you've whipped it in, so they're fighting with less attacks as well. You've presumably pulled them away from a banner effect. You've got fight 6. You've got 6 attacks and a might point. You are going to reliably eat a couple of things. So I think actually one of the better tactics with this is to have a cheap goblin shield wall and then bring the Watcher up behind it, and your opponent's going, oh, he didn't bring the Watcher up and move all my things about. I wonder what oh no, that's what he's doing, because now I can without
you can just pull stuff into combat with you.
Yeah, I can choose what the Watcher's going to fight. I just that hero is mine, and you get D6 shooting attacks every turn. So there's a decent chance that you're just gonna, okay, that's dead, that's dead, that's dead.
Good way of getting rid of banners that way.
You can get rid of banners, especially if you've got a scenario that involves being on objectives. Then you can just go, oh look, you're on that objective in domination, are you? Not anymore. Because you can move 4 inches, you've got a range of 6, and the size of that base is enormous. So
definitely.
So look, you asked what would be, are they viable? And I say the Watcher is more viable than the Drake, but neither of them are what you'd see on a meta table. They're a bit of fun.
I'd like to see
too much choice.
Yeah, I'd like to see a list that is just the Watcher in the water, a cave drake, and a dragon. I think that would be a lot of fun to play with.
I think if your opponent's got strikes, they're going to drag them down quite happily. But what's your question, Sam?
One, if you have charged cavalry into the Watcher, you've got your charge bonus. If you then whip them, do they then lose their charge bonuses because they've been pulled into combat, or has it already happened so it doesn't matter?
I mean, it's a monster anyway, so you get the extra attack if you charge it, but you don't knock it down unless you're very high of strength.
Okay, so you can't whip the ones who are already in combat and take away their charge bonuses. Okay, that's good to know.
No.
Other idea is what's got with the cave drakes, nest and that. You put it on an objective. You get the in hog ground or something. Get the cave drake into the middle, and then that way it's definitely not going to run away at the worst moment for you.
Yep, they are worth 150, 200 points though, so that's a very expensive objective sitter. For the cost of a cave drake, I could have 5 Warg Marauders who then go up to all of the objectives in domination and drop off. So you've got 3 on each objective, at least, possibly 4 if the Warg passes its courage test. But Moria, with access to monstrous brutal power attacks, really opens the game up a bit, because you got Hurl, get enemy heroes off horses. If the tentacles don't do that anyway, you can barge through things when Moria doesn't really have something that's capable of mowing through.
I mean, if you don't want to spend all your points on expensive monsters, you can still get a cave troll for 80 points. So they're still quite reliable.
I don't rate cave trolls very, very much because of the courage 3. So there's so much stuff that you want to be able to charge, but it doesn't. And there's also a lot of heroes now, like Boromir, Aragorn, Gil-galad, off the top of my head, that can just run into a cave troll and one-shot it. I think a dweller is more fun It suffers from having the larger base, but then it's got extra movement to help compensate for it. It's got lower strength and defense, but it can regenerate wounds. It's got the fight 7, which is a crucial part. And it's got courage 7, so it's reliable in terms of charging into things. So if you have a dweller and a bat swarm going around together, potentially, it's a nightmare. The other thing not to forget with the Watcher is, okay, so you're not knocking stuff down, you can still rend. So I whipped the King of the Dead into combat at the tournament last, and he's like, oh, defense 6. Like, yeah, I'm just going to rend you with 6 strength 6 attacks and do 5 wounds in one go. Don't need to be bothered with your defense 7.
No.
6 attacks is the highest attack stat in the game that I'm aware of off the top of my head. Although I only rolled a 6 to win the fight like once in the entire game, so it's not foolproof. It's only got 1 might. Yeah.
The one I was facing rolled multiple 6s. Don't worry, that's where it was all going.
Yeah, I mean, with 6 dice trying to get a 6, you're talking about mid 80% in terms of trying to get a 6 off combat. So yeah, hope that's helpful, Tom. The Watcher can be absolutely devastating if it's used correctly. The Cave Drake really struggles in terms of getting into combats in the first place because of the size of the base. So have fun with them.
Facing Legolas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And Orcris, that's the vital part. It likes Orcris.
Yeah.
So, as Josh would like us to say, like, share, subscribe, leave a comment below, and have a good one.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Yes, take care.
Bonus material. I sent Tom Hawker a couple of quick questions regarding today's topics, which I thought he might be interested in. Question 1. What would you say is your favourite elf character? And question 2. And what is the argument for believing Mahud Kings should be allowed to march? Tom's answer. My favourite elf character? Are you on drugs? But if I had to actually pick one, I suppose Legolas, because he becomes best friends with a dwarf. And Mahud Kings should march because, well, just because. Is that not good enough reason?